It's my turn to turn this over to Alice Schreyer. Alice's talk is Exploring the Past, Everything Old is New Again. Alice is the Interim Library Director and Associate University Librarian for Area Studies and Special Collections, as well as Curator of Rare Books. So you even have more titles than I have, Alice, at the University of Chicago Library. Previously, she worked at Columbia University's Rare Book and Manuscript Library, the Library of Congress, and the University of Delaware Library. And I know she's a very engaging and knowledgeable speaker, so I hope you'll join me in welcoming Alice Schreyer.
And every gal only had one fellow, no need to remember when, 'cause everything old is new again. Dancing at your Long Island jazz age parties, way to bring us some more Bacardis. Well, order now what they ordered then, 'cause everything old is new again. Get out your white suit.
Well, the stanza we missed, which I meant to start on, the words are up on the screen, starting with "Don't throw the past away." So Peter Allen and Carol Bayer Sager's advice in this 1974 showstopper is to get out your white suit, your tap shoes, and tails. Let's go backwards when forward fails. Well, this audience certainly doesn't need to be told, don't throw your past away. The community represented at this colloquium, collectors, curators, conservators, students, scholars, teachers, and booksellers, is devoted to saving the past as it is manifest in printed books. We are their stewards and custodians, readers and users, interpreters, ambassadors, and advocates. All works that achieve the status of classic sustain, perhaps demand, constant rereading. This is the enduring value of rare books. Just as readers across time and place discover something new, strange, and illuminating in the text of a classic, physical books present endless opportunities for new ways of looking and learning. So I want to focus on the final line of this verse, not the first, and talk about how in special collections, everything old is new again. I think Sarah alluded to this, and so will probably most of my co-speakers. The past 2 decades, I'd say, have been transformative in special collections. I'm really interested in this word, and I think it has some bearing on the last question about orphan works. As some of you know, the term transformative was invoked recently by Judge Barrington Parker in a June 10th, 2014 decision for the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. He upheld the decision by Judge Harold Baer for the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York that creation of a searchable full-text database counts as fair use and does not infringe copyright, as the Authors Guild had claimed. The ruling determined, quote, a use could be transformative if the function or purpose of the use is different from that of the original work, end quote. In making a corpus of digitized texts available for use by persons with print disabilities and for keyword searching, the Hathi Trust transforms books into something very different from what was intended by their creators, and thus does not violate the copyrights of authors. So let's think about all the uses in special collections that are very, very distant from what their creators ever imagined or intended. So this non-consumptive or distant reading, as it's sometimes called, may also open the door to archival digitization as a transformative use. Nobody ever wrote love letters for researchers to write their biography, but that is another story for another conference. So the transformation of special collections has been quite intentional. We've embraced energetic outreach and interactive teaching to bring students, especially undergraduates, into newly designed technology-equipped classrooms, abandoning the passive show and tell stations of the cross models of the past. Support from granting agencies, especially CLEAR, which I can use the acronym for now that Sarah's introduced us to it, enabled many libraries to reduce arrearages substantially, as have new approaches to archival processing and book cataloging that provide different levels of description depending on the type of material and how it is likely to be used. As we continue to uncover hidden collections, and our work is far from complete, we are also seeking ways to expand digital access. Our initial concern that digital surrogates might diminish interest in originals didn't last very long. We soon realized they attract new audiences and fulfill different study, research, and teaching needs for those who also consult originals. Digitization is fast becoming an expectation, not an add-on luxury. And one thing that Sarah didn't mention that I think is of great interest to all of us is that CLEAR has decided to terminate its current Hidden Collections program, and it excluded digitization from its initial wonderful Hidden Collections program, and is in the process of revamping it to focus on emphasizing digitization of rare and special collections. Some of you may have been or maybe following the blog, the CLEAR blog, about the process of rethinking the program, which is really fascinating if you want to get inside their thinking about how that program and what we've been doing in Hidden Collections has helped to change the landscape. But growing interest in digitization is driven by several factors. Just as we reached a tipping point where it is widely, broadly, uniformly understood that access to information about collections is to be online, access itself is rapidly coming to mean page images and searchable full text. And it also helps from the standpoint of funding agencies like Mel and CLEAR that the fear for the long-term sustainability of digital files has been calmed by the growth of robust and trusted institutional, organizational, and disciplinary repositories. Globalization also contributes to the shift toward digitization, motivating us to integrate our rare and unique holdings into a global cultural heritage. Finally, and perhaps most importantly for our consideration of the enduring value of special collections, digitizing special collections is transformative, allowing materials to be used for very different purposes than those intended by their authors as well as our predecessors. Researchers are combining descriptive bibliography, book history, and textual criticism with text mining, georeferencing, and linguistic analysis in ways that truly make everything old new again. Now, library administrators, guilty as charged, find it useful to describe libraries as laboratories for the humanities, to convey that funding for library collections, staff, and spaces is the equivalent to building, outfitting, and staffing state-of-the-art science labs. Collections are the equipment of the library as laboratory. Specialized subject librarians and curators build collections, work with library colleagues to ensure they are discoverable, and provide reference, instruction, and bibliographical services to facilitate and promote their use. But our work has typically ended at the reading room door when the researcher begins hers. But humanities scholarship is becoming collaborative, and so too is the relationship between librarians and researchers. Reflecting this trend, the 2015 Rare Books and Manuscripts section of ALA, now a conference, not a pre-conference, will, quote, focus on collaborative partnerships forged among archivists, librarians, researchers, and teaching faculty, and position libraries as laboratories for the humanities. I'd like to think of them instead as collaboratories. Special Collections is no longer simply a place to do research, but a research center, a name that many of us adopted early on in this transformation, and that's in fact the name of Special Collections here at Case Western. Just as a so-called embedded librarian provides specialized information and knowledge to a science research or business research team and becomes a full member of it, Special Collections librarians, along with metadata and technology specialists, provide essential expertise as part of research teams that form around library collections. Rare books have a starring role to play in these investigations. In the introduction to his recent book, A New Republic of Letters, Memory and Scholarship in the Age of Digital Reproduction, Jerome McGann makes a bold assertion, quote, "Here is a truth now universally acknowledged, that the whole of our cultural inheritance has to be re-curated and re-edited in digital forms and institutional structures." And no apology from McGann to Jane Austen. McGann describes his methodology as follows, quote, "I mean to explore the mechanisms of both production history and transmission history and their complex unfolding relations. In that analytic point of view, secondary documents, posthumous editions and transformation, for instance, are as important as the authorial manuscripts and early editions. So are all those attendant materials, reviews, and commentaries that expose and further define the character and meaning of the materials. What McGann calls secondary documents, he says, are especially critical in the study of antiquity. What memory would we have of the ancient world, of Sappho and Homer, for example, except for those secondary materials? None whatsoever. So I'd like to talk about a recently completed project at the University of Chicago's Special Collections Research Center that illustrates McGann's point and also the potential for partnerships among scholars, students, librarians, and collectors. It began as a close study of individual editions and copies of printed books of works by Homer, with a focus on transmission, reception, and translation history. In a surprising twist at the end, crowdsourcing and digital corpora solved a mystery that had totally eluded the team's efforts over several years. Both lines of investigation drew on expertise from several disciplines, and both yielded new knowledge that only could have been created using their respective methodologies. The first, the close study, resulted in a published collection catalog produced by 3 librarians, 3 faculty members, 2 graduate students, and a collector over 6 years. The second was a competition to identify marginalia in 1 volume that drew 50,000 online hits and took 36 hours to solve. Together, they illustrate the complementarity of enduring and new bibliographical techniques. We need to expand our research toolkit with new methods. As all good craft artists know, the most important element of a successful job is using the right tool. In 2007, Michael Lang donated his collection of 187 separate Homer editions in 259 volumes, ranging from the 15th to the 20th century, to the University of Chicago Library. In an essay he wrote for the collection catalog, Lang described 2 motivating factors in forming the collection. First, he wanted, quote, to apply or at least test the collector's belief regarding what one might call the, quote, substance of format, end quote, that a study of the physical printed book in which a text first appeared can add to one's understanding not only of the intentions of its author, editor, or publisher, but also of the impact that text had on its first readers, end quote. But he also acknowledged, quote, another species of value, an incalculable, impressionistic one that, at least in library budget requests, dares not speak its name. The one generated by the physical encounter between a student or scholar and original materials. The benefit of such experience does not lend itself to clinical analysis or even to lucid description. It is neither objective or logical, written by a lawyer, mind you, and those who have not expressed it often dismiss it as foolish sentimentalism, end quote. And if he was here today, I think that he would see, or at least sense, many heads shaking in agreement. So Michael Lang chose the University of Chicago as the home for his collection because his vision for its future aligned with the university's strong classical tradition and core curriculum. Homer has been and remains required reading for first-year students since the first year of classes in 1892. Among the most illustrious and influential publications commissioned by the University of Chicago Press, which was founded along with the university to disseminate scholarship, is Richmond Lattimore's translation of the Iliad, first published in 1949. In accepting the Lang gift, we made a commitment to continue building the collection by acquiring new editions and translations and developing it in new directions. For example, graphic novels, works for children, and illustrated editions. We also agreed to produce a scholarly catalog of the collection. This was no effort at immortality between boards. In fact, at every step along the way, we needed to persuade Michael Lang to allow his name to be used in any form, which is why the collection is named the Bibliotheca Homerica Langiana, or BHL. He's hoping nobody understands the Latin, I guess. The acronym helps. The catalog would allow him to witness and, as it turns out, participate in the process by which the gift of a private collection stimulates bibliographical research and teaching. It also fills a gap in the Homeric literature, who knew there could be any, that Lang himself recognized as a collector, the lack of an in-depth study of Homer in print. Our first task was to delineate the scope of the catalog. The BHL is very strong in early and significant Greek editions and near comprehensive for English translations. The story we wanted to tell had everything to do with physical books, but not their bibliographical description. Most of the big books had been described beautifully by others. We agreed that we would highlight substantive copy-specific information, such as provenance and marginalia, and that the original research would focus on the transmission of the text through editions and translations. So the graduate student who described the Greek editions read every preface in every one of the Greek editions, and we think that he's probably the only one who has ever done that, probably since the dawn of printing. Each item in the collection has its own entry and mini essay researched and written by a graduate student. The volume also includes scholarly essays by 2 faculty members and Michael Lang's on building the collection. Over the course of our work, we identified and resolved several questions that interrelated strands of bibliographical inquiry. One was textual, the second a matter of 18th century book trade practice, and the third relates to the history of reading. The most recent took us into the world of 20th century fine printing. The amount of time and effort devoted to investigating each puzzle is way out of proportion to the sentence that alludes to it in the catalog, but together they are great examples of the opportunities for discovery that arise in such projects, perhaps a boutique one, and how we functioned as a team to answer them. Lang proposed that for the English translations, we transcribe the first lines of each edition of both the Iliad and the Odyssey. I must confess that I did not at first see the value of this feature, but as soon as we began to look more closely, it became clear that they illustrate powerfully the great variety of literary genres, language, meter, and syntax across the translations. The opening lines of the page serve as an essential part of the narrative entries, which explore the translator's theoretical principles and editorial antecedents to understand his or her aim in producing yet another translation. Diana Moser, a PhD candidate in classics, researched and wrote the descriptions of the English translations. While working on Pope's Iliad, she discovered a first-line revision that completely eclipses an earlier version. In fact, the most respected scholars and editors of this canonical work, including Maynard Mack in his notes to the Twickenham edition, ignore it. So the first, 1715, which is shown here, and the second, 1720, editions of Pope's Iliad, and a 1729 reprint begin the wrath of Peleus' son, the direful spring of all the Grecian woes, O goddess, sing. In this first American edition, Philadelphia 1795, the opening lines are, Achilles' wrath to Greece, the direful spring of woes unnumbered, heavenly goddess, sing. This reading became the norm. The revised opening lines appear first in the third edition, 1731 to 32. I couldn't find any reference to it, why it happened, and why it stuck. So I contacted David Vandermeulen at the University of Virginia, and he pointed me to a reference, pointed out a reference to the change in the introduction of Stephen Shankman's 1996 Penguin edition of Pope's translation. As Vandermeulen remarked, Shankman's translation, only available in that Penguin paperback, reminds collectors not to ignore such unprepossessing editions. David just sort of walked over to his bookshelf to check it, but we didn't have it in our edition, in our collection. The revision may have been a response to criticism by John Dennis of Pope's phrase, quote, all the Grecian woes. Pope seems to have adopted a reading close to that of Thomas Tickell's translation of Book 1, sort of competitive edition, which also appeared in 1715, and read Achilles' fatal wrath, whence discord rose, that brought the sons of Greece unnumbered woes. Samuel Johnson, in his preface to the Poems of Tickell, remarks, to compare the two translations would be tedious. The palm is now universally given to Pope, but I think the first lines of Tickell's were rather to be preferred, and Pope seems to have since borrowed something from them in the correction of his own. The second discovery and investigation came up in the writing of one of the scholarly essays, entitled Quarreling Over Homer in France and England, 1711 to 1715. Professor David Ray looks at the so-called Homer quarrel, a skirmish in the well-known Battle of Ancients and Moderns. So this is the first edition of Madame Daciers' literal prose translation of the Iliad into French, which appeared in 1711 in the format of the popular 3-volume novel of the day. And here you can see it looking very much like a work of fiction, which was her point. Instead of bawdy French novels, you could be reading elevated epics, but they just happen to look like novels. So David Ray, in his catalog essay, compares her translation of the poem to several others, including that of John Ozell, who translated her prose back into English the following year. Ray had quoted a passage in verse, which during copy editing we discovered was printed as prose in the original. So here it is in Ozell's, the first edition of Ozell. David had quoted from this in verse. When I queried him, Ray explained that he had not transcribed it as it appears in the first edition because Ozell and all his contemporaries understood it to be a blank verse translation. In his preface, Ozell praises Daciers' translation, but then expresses doubt whether, quote, an English translation of Homer any otherwise than in verse can be made so as to please an English reader. Later, Ozell asserts that, quote, in all translations, regard ought to be had not only to the sense of the original, but to the very manner of the composition, which ought to be resembled as near as possible and not a new one introduced. Ray is convinced that Lintot printed the work as prose simply to save paper. Of course, we kept the blank verse form in his essay and included the explanation for the discovery in a footnote. And I'm happy to say that David Ray is contemplating what he describes as giving old Ozell his due by producing the first ever edition of Ozell's translation, printed as he intended it to be in blank verse. One question hovered over the entire project and was not solved until the publication of the catalog. Ever since he had purchased his copy of the Aldine 1504 edition of Homer's Odyssey in Greek, Michael Lang was intrigued by the script used for handwritten annotations in the second volume. Over the years we worked on the project, University of Chicago linguists from several departments examined the script and declared it not Georgian, not Turkish, not Armenian, and certainly not Greek. One day, Randall MacLeod, a book historian from the University of Toronto, had a look, and he claimed it was a form of shorthand, but no one took it any further. And here's another. But Lang was determined not to give up. As the project was winding down, catalog published, scholarly colloquium, and exhibition behind us, he offered to sponsor a $1,000 prize to the first person to identify the script, provide evidence to support the conclusion, and execute a translation of selected portions of the mystery marginalia. We posted images of 2 pages with dense annotations on our website, and quite naively, in retrospect, provided information on how to examine the book in our reading room. Of course, we were immediately flooded with requests for high-resolution images of all the pages with annotations, which we were very happy to provide. So this was the initial posting. News of the contest started spreading online, especially after it was picked up by the social media site Reddit, and became a global news story. I now understand completely what it means when something goes viral and the impact on one's email box. So these are the Google Analytics for the few days before and after, but even the lines that are, remember, it's in 20,000 is the first bar, so it really sort of peaked. Within 36 hours, we had a winner and 2 runners-up, all of whom arrived at the same conclusion. And the results were also widely covered, this one in a category I love called Weird Science. The winner was Daniel Mitelli, an Italian computer engineer and software developer in Milan, who is currently enrolled in a digital humanities course and training for a career in libraries and archives. Working with Giulia Aceta, a colleague of his who is proficient in contemporary Italian stenography and fluent in French, Mitelli identified the mystery script as the French system of tachygraphy invented by Jean Coulon de Thévenot in the late 18th century. Vanya Vishnik, a PhD student in classics at Princeton with an interest in cryptography, was the second contestant to identify the script and provide translations, as did Gallagher Flynn, a PhD student in linguistics at the University of Chicago. Based on the mix of French words with the script and a legible date, which no one had noticed before, of April 25th, 1854, the Italian team began with the assumption that it was a system of French stenography in use in the mid-19th century. So they examined every French 19th century stenography manual they could find on Google Books. After rejecting several, they found a chart comparing one of them to Thévenot's tachygraphy system published in 1789. They found an 1819 edition of Thévenot's work, revised by a professor of stenography, N. Paty, and armed with 2 contemporary French translations of the Odyssey, one published in 1842, the other in 1854 to 66, so bracketing the dates of the edition, began to translate the marginalia. In Thévenot's system, inspired by the shorthand system of Turonian notes that are said to have been invented by Cicero's scribe and used into the Middle Ages, quote, every consonant and value has a starting shape, and they combine together to form new shapes representing syllables, Mitelli explained. The vertical alignment is especially important, as the position of a letter above or below the line, or even the length of a letter segment, can change the value of the grapheme. This explains why most notes in the Odyssey shorthand are underlined, the line being the key to the transcription. I'm very glad that somebody understands it, because I don't. So Mitelli posted his analysis on the website. He posted the pages he had already translated and announced that he is continuing to decipher the annotations. And you can see that's his report. His work continues. He's also developed a really interesting hypothesis that may lead to identifying the writer of the annotations. Recently, I met a T.E. Lawrence collector. When I mentioned the 1932 Bruce Rogers edition of Lawrence's translation of the Odyssey, considered by Joseph Blumenthal and others to be the most beautiful book produced by the 20th century private press movement, he asked if our copy smells. So after I recovered from my surprise and tried not to look offended, we don't have a musty stack, he explained that the special ink used in the book gives off a distinct aroma. Turns out we have 2 copies, and sure enough, they both have a peppery aroma, distinct even when the book is closed, and it is much stronger in the copy in finer condition. The ink is made from oil of copaiba, popular today as one of the cure-all essential oils. We already know that the smell of individual copies of rare books provides evidence of the conditions in which they were read, and here is one feature of an entire edition that is unlikely, although of course not impossible, to be reproduced online. Of course, most research projects and special collections do not generate such worldwide excitement, but each one contributes to individual learning and sometimes to broader scholarship. In his essay on forming the BHL, Michael Lang observes that, quote, "Those engaged in critical analysis or serious scholarship are not immune to sensations of affinity arising from a physical connection with the subject of their study, and it is naive to discount the subtle effects of such sensations. On the other hand, it is equally naive to believe that university libraries should operate on romantic principles, plunking down hard cash to acquire original material in the hope that exposure will inspire and promote a greater quality of scholarship than might otherwise be the case. Here is where the private collector, able to act in support of intangible benefits, can play a useful role." The private collector, able to act in support of intangible benefits, can play a useful role. What practical wisdom and generosity of spirit are embodied in these words. As part of the larger interest in accountability in higher education, universities are understandably eager for data that documents impact. We need to remember that discoveries are often the results of, quote, intangible benefits, end quote. By its very nature, original research depends on sources such as rare books, manuscripts, and archives that do not reveal their secrets at first hand or at first glance, which is why gifts from collectors always have been and always will be essential to sustaining the enduring value of special collections. Social media and electronic resources made it possible for Danielle Matilli to identify the shorthand and translate the first fragments in a few hours on a Thursday night. As he said, "If I didn't have access to online sources such as Google Books, the Greek word study tool of the Perseus Digital Library, and the French corpora of the CNRTL, I probably wouldn't have won." What great times we live in. Yes, indeed. CNRTL is the National Center for Textual and Lexical Resources, which is a portal for linguistic resources and other research tools on French literary works. At the beginning of the 21st century, library directors were concerned about succession planning for special collections. Many curators and special collections directors were approaching retirement age, or so it seemed, and they were unsure where the next generation would come from. The anticipated crisis never really happened, and the profession is flourishing. Librarians and academics are drawn to careers in special collections librarianship, seeking out training and professional development at venues that have become more robust, responsive, and accessible, including library schools, continuing education programs, and professional organizations. Several benchmarks document this trend. In 2004, RBMS held its pre-conference in New Haven with 301 attendees. Attendance always varies at these events somewhat depending on location, although the 2009 pre-conference in Charlottesville, not known for being easy to reach, drew 412 for the organization's celebratory 50th. This year's conference in Las Vegas, which contrary to what some think is not a particular draw for bookies, was attended by 436, so quite a leap. And this is during a period when many libraries have had to reduce travel funding because of budgetary pressures. Rare Book School at the University of Virginia has grown in a similar and dramatic way. In 2004, 348 students attended classes. This year, the number was 422. Over the same decade, 39 new courses were introduced, with another 5 scheduled to launch in 2015. Rare Book School's pedagogy has always been founded on learning by handling and close examination of the stuff. The school is expanding beyond Charlottesville because offering courses in specialized topics requires access to first-class collections of relevant primary materials. This approach gives adult learners the same excitement and engagement, those intangible benefits that fuel research as undergraduate and graduate students experience when they use special collections materials in special collections reading rooms and classrooms. There are new programs that provide funding for those interested in special collections librarianship and for librarians who want to develop their bibliographical expertise. Both RBMS and RBS offer scholarships, and the Institute for Museum and Library Studies just awarded a grant to Rare Book School for the sole purpose of providing opportunities to those interested in special collections librarianship that will cover attendance at RBMS and RBS. Daniel Matilli summed it up perfectly when he remarked that the Homer contest confirmed his desire to work in special collections libraries or archives. Quote, "Where else would I find such wonderful mysteries to solve?" All of us who work with rare books and special collections feel that way every day. We are privileged to pass this ongoing process of discovery and learning on to coming generations who will find new ways to interpret and promote the enduring value of rare books. Thank you. And I do have time for questions. I'm happy to answer them. Are you thinking that it'll be a very nice long break if we end early? Nothing provocative. I'm disappointed. Yes. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Alice Campbell. I'm from Virginia Commonwealth University. And I wonder if some of these magnificent questions are surfacing in part because of a new generation of scholars who are online, who are on Reddit. Mm-hmm. Do you perceive generational differences in scholars and in their questions?
Yeah. It's easy to sort of answer that question with stereotypes, and we're all tempted to do that, but I think it is very clear that students entering college today and graduate students, relatively new graduate students, have totally different expectations and ways of working. So yes, I dare say there isn't a special collections library represented here that doesn't have either or all of the above: Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest or Instagram. I mean, we are very much trying to reach our users or prospective users where we think they will be. And I think that it may not be as much what questions they ask as what they want to do with the stuff. I mean, again, it's a cliche to say there's much more interest in the visual materials in our collections, which is why ephemera and the cataloging or processing of ephemera, really needs to be attended. I mean, I'd say almost that they're interested in different things and certainly approach it in very different ways. I do think there are generational differences, yes. Yeah. Terry? Oh, sorry.
I'm Terry Bellinger from the University of Virginia. Alice, there were no jobs in special collections to speak of beginning in the late 1980s, and there continued to be no jobs for a decade. While I agree completely with you about the enormous interest in special collections work, the staggering increased attendance at RBMS, which used to come in at 200 or 250 for most of my career, and the growth of Rare Book School, the jobs, it seems to me, were not correspondingly increasing. And one of the difficulties that Sir Thomas, for example, can tell you now is finding heads of special collections who should have entered the profession in the early 90s but did not because they could not. So this is one of the problems I think that we are facing and will have to continue to face. Do you not agree in the next decade or so?
I agree with the first part of your statement. Oh, I can move. I just forgot. I'm not locked in. How nice. Freedom. I think that a few things have happened since the turn of the century that are very interesting along these lines. I believe that many of us realized that in order to achieve the outraged success we wanted, we needed people dedicated to the work. And several special collections, and I think increasingly this is not an unusual position in a special collections of any size. I mean, there's still one-person facilities, but I think most special collections have a public services librarian, a user, an outreach and instruction librarian. So that's one sort of new niche in special collections of people who get a broader perspective. And a number of those people, I can point to two of them in this room who started in positions like that, who are now heads of special collections, and there are probably many more. It's a generalist position that gives you a broad perspective. The other thing that I think we would all be remiss in not calling attention to is the increasing frequency with which people who are coming out of the archival side of the field rather than the rare book field are becoming and making terrific heads of special collections. Why is that? Well, for one, I mean, I hope others have other suggestions. I think one thing is that, as Sarah suggested, and even in traditional formats, manuscript and archival collections are much harder to manage properly. And especially with digital formats coming in, even with literary manuscripts. I mean, it doesn't have to be university archivists. The challenges of the future in terms of management and expertise are, I believe, more in the archival realm than in the rare book realm. We have inherited phenomenal rare book collections. We continue to build them aggressively. We find new ways for them to be used, but we sort of know what we're dealing with, unless, of course, we are deciding to collect ebooks and comics online, and we also face that. So I think there are real issues, at least, and this may come out of my own experience, because for me, becoming a head of special collections, that's where the steep learning curve was, because I did not have an archival background. And appreciating the nature of that work, understanding the importance, and the challenges of uncovering hidden archival collections. I mean, talk about scale. You know, individual rare books and even collections of rare books sort of behave more neatly than archival. So I think there are new skill sets that we've brought into special collections, and people who have them are, in many cases, well suited to move into and aspire to move into administrative positions. So I think you're dealing with a different constituency as well.
But the pools are still thin.
I know that, Terry. I'm not going to deny that. But I think that I think in the next 5 years they'll be stronger, not weaker. Yeah, I do too.
Hi. Thank you, Alice. I'm Nora Blackman. I work here in the Calvin Smith Library. And I just wanted to address something from the top of your talk. You had mentioned distant reading opens the door to future digitization projects. Could you, I know you were listing it as kind of a bullet point. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, I probably ran over that too quickly because I'm fascinated, as I said, by those decisions and what they mean for archives and manuscripts. But I knew it was a digression, so my apologies. So distant reading, as you know, is sometimes called non-consumptive reading, and it's the use of a digital corpora not to read a text, but to mine it in some way, to do linguistic analysis, to, whatever. And a lawyer published a paper entitled, What does the Hathi Trust case mean for libraries? And he was mostly talking about the opening up of keyword searching in copyright materials and Hathi Trust, and which opened the door to all sorts of things that I won't go into now. But he had a parenthetical statement that he thinks it has profound implications for digitization of archival material. And I've been talking to several, it's really interesting, if you talk to members of the University of Chicago Law School faculty, you get a very different perspective on that than if you talk to someone in the Office of Legal Counsel. So, and I think we've all experienced that. I mean, it is the job of legal counsels to keep the university out of risky situations, and no one is saying that this isn't a risky situation, but it seems to open the door to argue that making archival collections available through digitization could be construed as a transformative use. But nobody go home and do that, please, okay? And I say so. But if you Google the name of the article, it's a very interesting one.